Western Macedonia in Europe. So on that day, all we know is that Mitra went to a local market and she never returned home. The police searched Mitra's house for clues with regards to her whereabouts, but found no signs of forced entry or that any struggle had occurred. So they were stumped as to where Mitra could have gone. Mitra's daughter was pushing the local police to launch a full investigation with regards to Mitra's disappearance. However, she felt as though the police were not taking her very seriously, and actually she felt that they were looking at her in a suspicious way. So she felt that she was getting nowhere with the local police and sought help elsewhere. Vlado Taneski was a freelance journalist and he lived just down the road from Mitra's house. He was known for covering quite controversial topics, often of a political nature, and often covered topics such as police corruption, and but he didn't really have anything to do with any major crimes. He had covered petty theft before and things, but nothing like a disappearance. So despite the fact that this wasn't something that Taneski would necessarily normally cover in his articles, he agreed to write an article for Mitra's daughter with regards to her mother's disappearance. Upon being published, the article gained quite a lot of local curiosity, but did not generate any leads into the whereabouts of Mitra. In the meantime, locally, some rumours were circulating with regards to whether Mitra might have left or fled of her own accord, possibly to escape or get away from a possessive, jealous boyfriend that she supposedly had at the time or was being harassed by. So again, they were no further to find in her, and actually everything else was swaying more towards her having left the city willingly. In the coming weeks, Vlado Taneski continued to cover Mitra's disappearance in further articles and actually continued to investigate the matter, with including interviews that he had conducted with Mitra's acquaintances and neighbours and people that knew of her to try and get to the bottom of her disappearance. However, no leads ever came from this and nobody really knew what on earth had happened to her. 2 months after Mitra's disappearance, on January 12th, 2005, a local scrap collector was searching for any items of value at a construction site of a local sports stadium on the outskirts of Kicevo. Upon just digging around for anything that he could take, he came across a shallow hole with just rubbish and garbage dumped in it, and within this hole, upon closer inspection, he actually discovered a plastic black garbage bag, and he believed that this contained human remains. The body was recovered and an autopsy revealed that the identity matched that of subsequently beat and tortured him to death and made away with nothing more than just some loose change. The perpetrators were also reported to have been under the influence of drug and alcohol at the time of the attack. Both of them were quickly identified and arrested, and their identities were released as being Kicevo locals named Ante Risteski and Igor Mercheski. A connection was quickly established between the murder of Radislav and that of Mitra, and actually the two arrested admitted to both of the murders and were subsequently charged accordingly. However, by the time the trial started, both Risteski and Mercheski retracted their statement in relation to Mitra's murder, stating they had absolutely no involvement in her abduction and murder, but maintained the accountability for Radislav's murder. Both Risteski and Mercheski stated that they had been beaten into confessing for the murder of Mitra, and they were made to do so the police could secure a quick case closed conviction for Mitra. However, one of them actually had a pretty solid alibi for the day that Mitra had been taken, as he was working away at the time, but despite this evidence, they were both sentenced to life in prison for both murders. Kicevo is a very small city, and nothing like this had ever happened in the area, so the murders actually attracted a lot of national media attention, and on the day of sentencing, Vlado Daneski actually was in court, taking notes along with everybody else from the media to watch the sentencing take place for a story that he had been covering since the very beginning, when Mitra's daughter asked him to write the article for her mother's disappearance. In early November 2007, so almost 3 years to the day that Mitra disappeared, Lubitsa Lakoska, a 56-year-old cleaner who lived in Kicevo at the time, went to buy groceries from a local supermarket, and 2 days later she still had not ever made it home. On November 12th, her son filed a missing persons report to the police, and again there was nothing that suggested foul play. The house was not in disarray, there was no sign of forced entry, she simply vanished, just like Mitra had. However, the locals and the media were very quick to notice the similarities between Lubitsa's case and that of Mitra. On February 3rd, 2008, so almost 3 months from Lubitsa's disappearance, a local trucker passing through Kicevo stopped on the side of the road, and something in a roadside ditch caught his attention. Upon inspecting the roadside ravine, he actually discovered a human hand sticking out of some rubbish that had been dumped there, and he obviously reported his finding to the police. An autopsy subsequently confirmed the identity of the body found as matching that of Lubitsa Lakoska, who had gone missing 3 months earlier. Again, she had been beaten, raped, tortured and strangled to death with a telephone cord, and subsequently bound by the hands and feet with the telephone cord prior to being disposed of in a plastic garbage bag. The time of death was placed as being just days prior to the discovery of her body, which meant that Lubitsa had been tortured and held captive for the 3 months that she had been missing. The similarities between Mitra's disappearance and subsequent murder, and the finding of Lubitsa's body, and the circumstances surrounding it just too difficult to ignore at this stage, especially for Vlado Doneski, the freelance journalist who had been covering Mitra's case from the very beginning. So again, he got stuck in and started investigating the Lubitsa's murder and trying to find similarities and connections between that and the murder of Mitra. On May 7th, 2008, a local elderly cleaner named Sivana Demakoska, she was 65 years old at the time, was sitting at home alone when she heard a very startling radio broadcast. In this radio broadcast, it was stated that Sivana's son had been involved in a terrible car accident, and upon hearing this news, Sivana fled her house with a worried look on her face, quote, from those that were around and saw her at the time, and she is reported to have walked very briskly towards in the direction of the local hospital. Her son was actually perfectly fine. He returned home to an empty house that same evening, and upon realising that his mother was nowhere to be seen and he couldn't contact her, he reported her missing. He inquired with neighbours and local witnesses that had learned of what had happened earlier that day, and that's when he learned of the radio broadcast that stated he had been in an accident, and actually this is then what led his mother, Sivana, to leave the home so abruptly earlier that day. He reported his mother missing to the police, and at this point the police also confirmed that there were no car accidents reported at all that day. So it became evident at that point that it was probably an elaborate hoax done specifically to target Sivana and to coax her out of her home. The very next day, a local woman walking to kindergarten reported hearing a ringing sound. So she diverted from where she was originally going to follow the sound of the ringing, and eventually this led her to a patch of grass where she found a mobile phone. She picked up the phone and answered it, and it was the police on the other end. The police ordered her to identify herself and to stay where she was, and upon arriving at the scene, the police identified the phone as being that of Sivana, and due to the location where it was found, they could determine that it was most likely thrown out of a moving vehicle, which indicated that foul play was involved in Sivana's disappearance. On May 16th, 2008, a local person was fueling their car at a gas station on the outskirts of Kicevo, and again something caught their eye, and they discovered once again a plastic garbage bag containing human remains, which were later identified as matching Sivana's identity. And once again, Sivana was found to have been beaten, tortured and raped, and subsequently strangled to death with a telephone cord. The telephone cord was then used to bind her by the wrist and feet, prior to her being disposed of in the same manner as Lubitsa and Mitra. The only difference with Sivana was that she had been disposed of wearing a green polka dot nightie that actually did not belong to her. The other two victims were disposed of with no clothes, but they were not wearing anything. So this was the main difference between this case and the previous two, that again completely baffled investigators at the time. An autopsy confirmed that Sivana was likely killed on the same day as her abduction, and she had been really quite severely beaten. She had major scene, and this was then sent away for DNA testing. It, at this point, was evident that Kicevo had a serial killer on their hands, and this made huge international news at the time because it was unheard of for a city, a peaceful and small quiet city such as Kicevo. Vlado Donetsky, the freelance journalist, continued to investigate and report on all of the 3 murders, and actually continued to make more connections between the cases, including the weapon of choice, the telephone cord, and the fact that it had all been strangled and bound prior to being disposed of. And in this specific article, Donetsky actually came up with the name of the Kicevo monster for the serial killer that was on the loose at the time. Donetsky was also the first to publicly question whether the first murder, Mitra's murder, was the work of the Kicevo monster and not the work of the 2 that were serving a lifetime sentence for it in prison. And it's worth noting that the 2 of them actually continued to proclaim their innocence for Mitra's murder up until this point. Upon making the connection between the 3 murders, not just the last 2, a judge ordered for a review of Mitra's case, and during this inquest they discovered a major error. So there was actually semen that had been retrieved from Mitra's body, and although this was tested, the DNA that had come back at the time was not a match to either one of the 2 men serving a life sentence for her murder. This information was known by investigators prior to the trial, but it was never presented in court, and it was discovered that this was purposely withheld at the time. Upon the discovery of this fact, the 2 men were both cleared of their wrongful conviction for Mitra's murder. However, they remained in prison for Radislav's murder, which they both accepted accountability for. No one in the police was ever held accountable for the fact that this key piece of information was withheld during the trial, or even though this allowed for the Kicevo monster, for a serial killer to continue to roam and kill 2 more women up until this point. At this point, all eyes were on the Kicevo police, and they actually collaborated with the capital's police force so that more resourcing could be put into this, into the cases. They came up with a profile for the perpetrator. So they came up with the idea, or the profile is a middle-aged, able-bodied male. He would have had to have some significant strength to be able to transport the bodies, and he was thought to be intimately familiar with Kicevo. There was also no struggle at the victims' homes, and it is possible that he was known to all 3 of them at the time. He was known to all 3 of them, and they may have willingly gone with him. He was thought to have been of higher than average intelligence due to the fact that the murders were clearly premeditated and well planned, and also highly organised. They, in this profile, also stated that it was clear by the way the bodies were disposed of that the serial killer, the murderer, wanted them to be found at some point. So the investigation took a pretty big turn when it was discovered that a jersey found near Ivana's body had blood splatters on it which did not belong to Ivana. So at the force interviewed all 150 men, and by process of elimination again, they whittled it down further to just 10 names of possible suspects. The police were then able to narrow this down even further to the point where they just had 3 names in front of them, and at this point they requested DNA samples from all 3 men and they complied. At this point, Vlado Teneski, the freelance journalist, had been covering the cases from the very beginning, and he was still covering the cases. He was the lead journalist for the whole investigation for the city at the time. He stated in his latest article that police were still working hard to identify the perpetrator, the murderer. However, unknown to him and the wider media, the police at this point were pretty confident they knew who the killer was. On June 20th, 2008, an unknown contact within the police force at the time reached out to local media and told the person on the other end of the line that the Kicevo monster had finally been caught. This is the first they heard of this, and immediately they called Teneski, the freelance journalist covering the cases, as he was best placed to take this break-in story and run with it, as he had done to date. Upon calling Teneski's phone, they got no answer, which was quite unusual for Teneski, as he would have been all over this discovery, and at this point they thought, actually, do you know what, he's probably 2 steps ahead of us and already at the station questioning police, trying to find out the identity of the killer. Earlier that same day, police closed in on a quiet, seemingly normal house in Kicevo and placed 56-year-old Vlado Teneski under arrest for murder. Onlookers were pretty shocked as they watched him being led away in handcuffs. The evidence that led to Teneski's arrest was just, at the beginning, a build-up of suspicion on the police's part. For example, Teneski was the first person to write of a wrongful conviction of the first 2 men that went to prison for Mitra's murder, before this was even ever reviewed, before a judge ever called for Mitra's case to be reviewed. However, you could argue that, given the similarities and the fact that 2 more murders occurred whilst they were in prison, this wasn't really too far-fetched of an idea for him to having to write about. However, he was also the first person to suggest that a serial killer was responsible for all 3 murders, and he would have had the means to submit a false car crash report to the local radio stations for a fake broadcast to be made, the broadcast that led Savannah to flee her home towards the hospital. He often submitted reports to the local radio for inclusion in the daily broadcasts, so he definitely had the means to do this, and if he was the serial killer involved, he had the motive to do this as well. What really sealed it for the police was that in the article about Lubitsa, he specifically wrote about her being strangled with a phone cord, and this detail was not publicly known at the time. The police actually strategically withheld this from the public to try and identify the murderer should the detail of weapon of choice actually ever rise, and it did in Teneski's article about Lubitsa. So his articles covering the cases had the police suspicious for quite a while. They were watching him, and actually it later transpired that each one of the women was an associate of his late mother, who was also an elderly local cleaner. The results of Teneski's Taneski's siblings leaving home, he was actually left behind to care for his elderly parents on his own. Taneski has a passion for journalism, and upon his graduation he began to work at a local metal factory. However, his aspirations later led him to enroll in a political school in Croatia. At 21 years old, Taneski attended a regional poetry reading, which was actually really quite successful for him. Not only did his poem win first place at the reading, he also met a young law student named Vesna. The two began dating shortly after meeting and married 4 years later. However, just days before their wedding, Vesna's family was in a horrific car accident, which resulted in her father and brother losing their lives. Vesna survived, but she was plagued by severe depression for the rest of her life as a result. However, she did actually manage to graduate, and she became the first female lawyer in Kicevo. So, due to the depression and all sorts of other factors, their marriage wasn't the easiest of marriages, but they were relatively okay. They were happy. Vesna stated that she found it difficult to deal with Taneski's authoritarian parents. They were quite strict, and Taneski clashed with them quite a lot. And although he didn't seem to get on with them that well, Vesna observed him always siding with his mother if she ever spoke against her, despite the fact that he was at the receiving end of some unpleasant words or actions from his mother. He always would stand up for her. During their marriage, Taneski secured a full-time position as a reporter for the local newspaper, and they had 2 very successful sons. The Taneskis owned a pretty secluded summer cottage just on the outskirts of Kicevo, and in August 2002, Taneski's father was found dead in the cottage, and it was rumoured that the cause of his death was suicide. Shortly after, his mother accidentally took an overdose and also died in the home, which led to some severe financial hardships for Taneski at the time in terms of maintaining the cottage and all of the associated bills. The newspaper that Taneski worked at encountered some difficulties, and his wife Vesna became the breadwinner essentially. She was the one that was bringing in the regular salary for the household. However, she was offered a promotion which would have required her to move to the capital. She agreed and bought a place out there so she could be closer to work, and Taneski stayed behind, and he said he would join her when the timing was right. At this point, Taneski was a freelance journalist, and he was only paid commission for the articles that he published. He opened a local air conditioning store to make ends meet at the time, so he was really struggling financially. Taneski was obviously committed to fulfilling the career that he had chosen for himself, and therefore secured himself was there, he ate all his meals. He did not exhibit any concerning behaviour at all. However, as they dragged his body out of his cell to try to revive him, they actually contaminated the scene, the crime scene. So it was concluded that it was a suicide given the accounts of everyone that found him and was there at the time. However, without really seeing him in the position that he was found, it was quite difficult for anyone to determine otherwise. Due to Macedonian law, there were no further legal proceedings against Vlado Donetsky, because this can't be done if the accused is deceased at any point. So that was that really. There's a lot of debate as to whether it was suicide. There are some claims that some believe he was a victim of waterboarding to try to get him to confess to the murders. Some believe he was framed by the police due to the detail that he was able to put in his articles, and as a result of him unearthing police negligence in Mitra's case. Some believe his DNA was planted or fabricated at the scenes to ensure a quick conviction. However, given the political stance of Macedonia, post-Yugoslavia at the time, it was actually that the country had more to gain from them conducting a fair trial than any of the other theories. At this point, what really brought this home for everyone that believed he was guilty